June 27, 2023, 6:40 p.m. Blick hot press watercolor paper, 100% cotton. We'll see what happens. This is one of those barrel tips. I haven't used it for a while. We'll see. This is carbon black, platinum carbon black. That should be there. I just wanted to make a dark line. It's totally not where it should be. It should be dark on the other side. This is the first time that I've tried to sketch with this pen. I've done some test line making before doing this. It's a very stiff nib, and it's not something that I would normally choose. I don't use it much since then, and doing other drawings, I just don't use it a lot. I initially got a brass version of this pen and found that the brass was too heavy in my hand. So I gave that to a landscape painter friend of mine because she could make unusual marks in her landscape drawings. And then I ordered this steel-tipped one, and it's lighter, and it is fun to play with. I really can't say that I highly recommend it. If you're just getting into dip pens, it's not the nib that I would start with. It is very stiff, and it will not move as smoothly. If you work as quickly as I do, you're constantly hitting the drag with the pen and not being able to make some of those smooth moves that you might otherwise want to make. And so it's a little bit perhaps frustrating to learn on a pen like this. But as you can see, it makes some really fabulous marks, and it holds a lot of ink before you need to redip. You might not think about it when you're starting to work with a new pen, but actually knowing how to place the pen on a piece of paper and how the ink is going to be applied and how the nib is going to deform or not deform is a huge part of drawing with any kind of dip pen. And when you're used to doing using a pen nib that's very, very flexible, and you then try and use something that is much more rigid like this, you find yourself maybe putting a line not exactly where you thought you were going to put it. And so you have to restate that line, or maybe you have to do some business to distract from that line and draw the eye away from it. Sometimes you double down and you try and restate in the same area so that you can get something that is a double line effect. I mean, there's a lot of things that happen, but it's all because you're not used to using that pen and feeling the way it connects with the paper. And so it's really important that you understand that and that you not give up on your first tests with a new pen of any type. You're going to have an adjustment period. You're going to have a getting to know period to see what kinds of marks it can make. And certainly you can try out and test on a sheet of paper by just drawing multiple lines and trying to draw curves and things like that, which is all something I did before I sat down and did this drawing. But regardless of all the pre-tests you do, it isn't going to be until you start to take this shadow shape and this line and this edge and what I want to be lost and what I want to be found, and you take all of that in your brain and try and use this pen to create it on paper, that you're going to have a real test drive. And that's what you're seeing here is a real test drive. And because the pen nib is heavy and it is rigid and it has a weird connection to the paper, you see me dragging and making sort of clipped movements with my hand because it doesn't move the same way that other nibs do. You also see me when I'm judging the ink flow in the pen and think I'm down to a little bit less ink volume. I'm going over to the areas where I want lighter lines and I'm putting stuff in now, little dots like you see there, little whiskers like you see there. So before you reload, you want to use the minimal amount of ink that you have. And this is the controllability of ink flow that you get with all nibs, but it's very important when you're trying a new nib to play with that and to go into less important areas to make little test marks perhaps, or to just remember to watch for when the ink is going low so that you can go ahead and put in marks in those areas where you don't want big blobs of ink. Otherwise, you're going to get big blobs of ink everywhere that you don't want them. Besides being a new pen nib, this is really the first time I've sketched on this Blick paper. I may have done one other sketch before that with just my professional brush pen from Sakura, something I'm very, very familiar with, that pen. But so I'm still not used to this paper. And one of the things that you need to also do is go through the process of sketching, always looking to see, am I causing too much ink to be in one area? How is the paper responding to that? And you'll see in a moment here that I make a comment about the nib scratching up the paper. With less rigid nibs, you can certainly scratch the paper up, but it's much more difficult to do so. Some of the very sharp pen nibs you can scratch into the paper, but generally it takes a really heavy hand and a really sharp and rigid nib to tear things up. So this is an unusual thing for me, and I'm a little frustrated by it, but right now I'm experimenting with those bolder lines this nib can create. This is scratching up the paper a little bit. Besides the heaviness and rigidity of the nib being a factor to scratch the paper, and the paper's sizing and receptivity to the ink, the amount of ink that you have on a paper and then try and make additional marks on top of that while the ink is still dry can be problematic. So you also need to work around the paper, letting areas dry. Messy, messy, messy. As I put in the neck and I put in the background shapes in just a moment, what I'm looking at is for anchor points on the rest of the face and the head shape where I can put those lines in. So how far between the lips and the chin, how far between the ear and the neck, also across the space, what lines up and what doesn't. It's obvious that I haven't tilted the head in quite the correct way, but when I put that second eye in and it was a little high, I decided, as you've always seen me do, to go with it. You either redraw it or you go with it, and I went with it in this instance. So the tilting of the head being off is going to mean that some of my anchor points are not going to be exactly right. And then what you do is you make approximations. Where do you want it to be? You know that the jacket is going to come out near the ear on the right side, but do you want it to be a little lower? Do you want it to be higher? You have to work out those things and decide where it is that you want to draw them in if they, if you haven't been exact in all of your placement of stuff. But you are looking horizontally and you're looking vertical to see what lines up with what. I've cut out my preparation to get my watercolors and stuff out, but I do want you to see that I did get ink on my hand, which transferred to the right side of my paper. And so because there is so much ink on this paper, I'm actually going to put a piece of paper on top of it and blot. And as I was blotting, I decided that I'm going to make a mask. I'm going to cut out a mask for this head, and I'm going to use some mixed media techniques and add the background with some rubber stamping. So you see me here going around. It's some kind of lightweight paper. I think it's newsprint, and I'm just making a rough mask to cut out. The cutting happens really close to the camera and you can't really see, but it's just simple cutting, following the outline. And so what I've done is I've cut most of that out, so you just see it as I put the mask down completed. This next bit of the video is me using rubber stamps to create a textured background. Most of my ink pads, it's for various reasons, which I don't even think you can read about on my blog anymore because that stuff is in the archive. But the brand that I really like is not available. And so most of my rubber stamps are pads are pretty dried out. And you'll see me tape this down in a minute with Nichiban artist masking tape. But basically what I'm trying to do is just get some colors behind the figure. And you do this by masking the figure and then stamping across and over and through the figure so that things go right to the edge when you're stamping. Now, in order to do this successfully, you want to avoid something called a halo. And I don't think I pressed on that last one to do that. But you want to have the mask slightly smaller than the drawing, because when you press down, the thickness of the paper is going to hold your stamp a little bit up, and then it sort of tapers down to the edge of the image. It's something that you can practice with. And so if you are getting halos, you need to push harder to maybe have a little bit more ink, but also you know that you might have to draw and cut your mask so that it is smaller within the black lines of your tracing as opposed to outside. And typically I do draw within, and so you wouldn't see on the mask itself, you wouldn't see the black lines. They would be on the part of the mask paper that I threw out. But now I'm just trying to use different ink colors and create something going on in the background, and we'll continue with that. But mainly it's just for texture, just for fun. I think it's good when you're doing paintings to experiment with different things, to use mixed media, but also to just play. And so this is the play portion of this. I've had the grueling experience of drawing with the new rigid nib, and now I'm sort of rewarding myself for that. A good deal of drawing is about stamina and about the patience and dedication to just keep going. And if you need to take a break, not so much stopping the whole process, but to think about things and process things. So here, while I'm doing this, I'm still thinking about the color palette I want to use when I start to watercolor paint, and what will the impact of this textured background have on my choices there. So this is giving me time to play, but also in this downtime, I get to think about the things that are coming up. And I think that's very important in the drawing process, especially if you work very, very quickly. Now, my intention was to sit down and to try the nib and test the paper. And at some point, the switch just went on, and I wanted to put the rubber stamps in the background. I've gotten another box of rubber stamps out. I don't have very many rubber stamps anymore, so the options are limited. But I got a box of stars out, and I wanted to put stars in the background, and that's what you see me do now. But again, my ink pads are so dry that it's not really very successful as far as what's going down on the paper. And the other thing I'm trying out and testing is, how does Blick paper like rubber stamp ink? This happens to be a pigmented ink. It's by Brilliance, and as far as I can tell, it's no longer made. The colors of ink pad ink I've used will pretty much go with anything. They're pretty neutral, and I know I'm going to put some color on top of them, so that will knock them back some more. But I'm also conscious of the fact that I've got a very pink face, and it would be nice to have some green in the background. I don't know if anything's going to come of that at this point, but I keep going with that expectation. I also think when you're using a pattern stamp, you want to have it around the entire figure. You want to have it coming from behind the figure, as you see in a couple instances. You want to have it fully shown somewhere. It isn't fully shown anywhere really except in the top right corner. It's almost fully shown. But you want to have enough of the pattern shown in different areas so that the viewer's eye can reconstruct that whole figure. Otherwise, you want to play with the idea that they can't, which is certainly a thing, but that's a little bit, I think, hostile. So we want to give them the visual information that they want. But you do want also to have things go off the page when you're doing a background like this. Otherwise, it seems very chopped and unintentional. Whereas it's sort of counterintuitive, but when you actually go off, it has a freer, more open look and better balanced. Now, this isn't going to ultimately be viewable, as you'll see in a little bit, but those are my thoughts when I'm thinking it's still going to be viewable. These are the things going through my mind while I'm putting these down. All of those kinds of issues. So I'm going to take a moment here to put my rubber stamps away and my rubber stamp pad so that I have more working space. And that's what you see going on here, but I've also just pulled the mask off, looking at what it is that I'm going to be painting. And then I'm going to start getting my paints organized so that I can begin the process of painting. I started with the idea when I sat down that I was going to do something loose because of the ink nib that I was using. And so I've decided that I'm going to start laying in some color with this 1-inch wide brush. It's kind of a flat wash brush, very inexpensive brush. And I'm just going to get some main little blocks of color in. Here I'm starting with the red because he has very pronounced red on the nose, red in the mouth, and on the ears. So I'll get some of that in to suggest those colors. And again, being very loose with this and having the wider brush, I can use the tip of the brush like you saw me, the corner, like you saw me do right there. When you have a flat brush like this and you want some more accuracy. But basically, I'm trying not to be really accurate, but just to be loose and easy with what's going on. Get some layers down. This particular ink doesn't necessarily dry quickly, and I'm finding that there is a little bit of bleeding where I have heavier areas of ink on this paper. You can see when I go into my palette box that getting that tip of the brush into the little half pan is difficult. I sprayed some of my colors before I started, but not everything in my palette, and I will be continuing to wet them as I move along. But again, I don't care about partial loading of the brush. I just want to get some things to make certain strokes and put color on certain areas of the face and let it be loose, and also trying to avoid the heavy ink areas that maybe haven't quite dried yet. Ideally, I would suggest that you always work with 2 buckets of water, one to clean your brushes in, and then a second brush bucket of water where you can put your clean brush, one that's been rinsed in the dirty water, and then dried out on a paper towel or mopped out on a paper towel. And then you put that one in the clean water and get clean water. As you see, because my water is going to be visible throughout this video, I think towards the end, you'll see that the water is getting quite dirty. And I think that that can be a detriment, especially if you're first learning to watercolor. It's really important that you keep 2 buckets of water. I usually do when I'm doing paintings that are like wall paintings that I really need color, not just journal sketches. I really need the colors to be correct and accurate. And the problem is, though, my setup with the camera has such little viewing. I have to keep everything tight in, and then you see a smaller picture of what I'm working on. And so it's like, what can I show you? And what space do I have on the desktop to have all these things that I normally have? And so how I work for these videos is not always exactly how I work. I normally do have 2 buckets of water when I'm in the studio, if I am making something that is considered a finish painting, not just a sketch. Now, during the time when I was sketching this piece, I was using uh, a, um, a cloud gray or sea gray or something like that on this palette that you see here. And I wanted to use that blue so that I could make a certain kind of gray that I wanted to have in this particular portrait. And so I've mixed that blue and that red, and they're slightly neutralizing each other. The blue is already neutralized, and it's being canceled out a little bit by the red because it's a uh, warm red, and there's a sort of a complement kind of ghosting thing that's going on with the way the two are structured. And you can look at my color chats to understand more about that. But I really want that neutralized look, and I'm going to use that to darken the value around him. But I want that color, and that's why I switched to the plate where that pigment was already laid out and been used in many, many other paintings previous to this. The really nice thing about using this large flat brush is I can stroke in a lot of color really quickly, as you just saw there. I'm also getting some interesting puddles, which I'm leaving, and I'll either cover later with darker values or play with in some other way. But again, opportunity to just get some color in quickly. I had some burnt sienna out on the palette and some browns, some colors that I was going to use to neutralize various blues I was working with. And so I have gone in and I have pulled that up onto my brush, and I'm using it to lay in a background. And at this point, I'm still thinking, how can I make big swatches of swoops of color and get uh, some of that background to still show through. At this point, I've also realized that this paper is repelling my watercolor washes. It's literally repelling the paint. This is not a good thing, and for that reason, I don't recommend this paper. I did other paintings where I tried to see if it was just one sheet, but it was consistent. And whatever they're doing with the sizing, it's really not wanting to accept the watercolor. Now, you can see this is a bad thing, and it is if you want to do traditional watercolor and lay in all your glazes and all that other good stuff. But what I decided immediately, because I want to focus on what I'm getting done and what's positive, is that I'm going to keep going and I'm going to work with that. And I continue to work with the pad and had that always in mind when I was working with it so that I knew that I could get something done and on the paper. We'll see there that I just put in the first layer for the eyes, and you have to work in areas and let things dry and then go back to them. So since the background and the clothing is wet, I'm going back into the face to work on it. And it's hard to tell, but I'm not letting my hand touch the paper. If you have trouble getting your hand in wet paint, buy yourself an artist's bridge, which is an acrylic bridge that goes over your paper and provides an elevated rest for your hand so that you can slide the paper up and down underneath the bridge. It doesn't touch the bridge, and then you can work from resting on that bridge. So look for an acrylic bridge. They're available through art supply stores everywhere. And that's the best thing to do if you have that problem. Now, if you're out and about and you have that problem, you're going to have to train yourself just not to put your hand in paint because you aren't going to be able to use a bridge when you're out and about. But if you're at home sitting at a table or a desk or studio desk, then you can go ahead and use an acrylic bridge. While the eyes are still a little bit damp, I'm putting in a little bit of a mix of white because of what I want to do with his eyes and making it a lighter kind of blue. I've blown up the image now so that you can see still most of it. You won't see some of the action that happens on the edges for the next little bit, and you won't see the water in the palette. But I wanted you to see a little bit more closely what was going on with me laying down the paint, and in hopes of you seeing how I am working on dry paint or wet paint based on the glare and things like that. So that's what's happening now as I've upped the size of it so that you can see it a little bit better. And now I'm going to start really hitting the contrast in the eyes. It's very important to me because I want the contrast to draw the eye there for the viewer. And I'm using a neutralized red, which has a bit of blue in it and is almost like a perylene maroon. I really want to get that darkness. I don't want to take the warmth out of it because you can see in his eye sockets, even though they're in shadow, he has a lot of warmth there. So I want to keep it warm, but I do want it neutralized into that darker perylene maroon kind of range. So I'm adding the voiceover to this piece over several sessions because of time constraints when I actually was able to do it. So there may be some repetitions of some ideas, but it's important to listen to the restatements so that you really think about them. And one of the things that I want to really make a point of this month in which I'm showing this video to you is that I want you to think about pushing during the process of making your paintings, your drawing or your painting, pushing and going a little bit further, trying things. It was pretty obvious from my sketch that I'm not an exact likeness, that there's a dent in his head, on both sides of his head actually in my drawing. I'm not bothering about that. I'm just going forward. And what I want you to get into the habit of doing is to set time to draw, set your intention of what it is that you're going for, what your goal is for the piece, and then attempt to do that. And if something happens during the process, like you put an incorrect line down that's going to ruin the likeness, decide in the moment whether you're going to restate the line correctly and therefore have a little bit more noise in your drawing than usual, or if you're going to try and cover it later with opaque paint, or you're just simply going to leave it and let go of having likeness. These are all legitimate things to do. And you might have voices, your internal critic, telling you to stop because this isn't right. And instead of listening to those voices, just remind yourself that what you're doing is practice, that you're trying things out. And if it's not right, it's okay because I'm going for finish. It's very important for you to finish things. Too many people let their internal critic stop them when they're part way through something and they never finish anything. And if you don't finish a painting, if you don't finish a sketch, you don't know what's really important. So many times you've watched me draw, and I've made something that looks like a fatal error early on in the process, but I save it in some way. And that's the skill that I think is the most important skill that I can teach you how to do, to quiet your internal critic voice. And when you do make a departure from either what your intention was or the likeness or whatever it is, that you are resilient enough to see it and say, okay, now I'm going to go for something X, and I'm going to adapt, and that's what I'm going to get down, and I'm going to work and do my best job at that. And then I'll assess it when I'm done, when I'm finished. There isn't any point in assessing it as a failure while you're working. You just want to keep going and see what finish can I bring to this? How can I push this? How can I juggle these elements? How can I add new mixed media to it? And over the next couple of months, I've actually got some videos which I call Working in the Weeds, which I'm going to be showing you so that you really get a sense of this and that you start doing this for yourself. It is the number one thing, finishing something and understanding that you can change and move into a different direction in the process is going to be something that will really help you immediately start to improve not only your drawing practice and how you think about your art, but also will increase the artistry in the art that you're making, and it will magnify the enjoyment and satisfaction you have doing it. Now, just a couple strokes previous to this, you saw me put in the first of that spinel brown. Spinel brown is a very opaque brown paint. It's got an orangey tinge to it. I doctor that by putting more orange into it or putting blue into it to neutralize it. And you can see it can cover areas like it does in that top left area. It can cover the hair strokes. So, but at the same time, you can use it as I did in the beard, and it can be a lighter layer. So one of the things I'd like to encourage you to do is to play with the qualities of the different paints that you have in your paint box. Use some of those that, when used at full saturation, are very opaque. Use some that are always more or less transparent, and play with them and see what you can do, because you never know exactly what you're going to need until you're in a situation where you think, oh, I really wish I had a paint that did this, that it was opaque, that it was um, you know, uh, very translucent, whatever it is. And so by playing with your paints now and thinking what you can do with them, and this is something that you may actually want to start to make some charts and see and experiment with the paints. Remember, this is not a waste of paint to do these kinds of tests, because what you're doing is using ultimately a very little bit of paint to see what the paint can do, so that when you're in the throes of creation and actually making something, you know exactly what that paint can do and you can reach for it and use it appropriately. So I really want to encourage you to do that as well. So here I'm thinking about contrast, always thinking about contrast, but I'm thinking about what I'm going to do with the beard and what I'm going to bring up. And I know I want darkness in that beard, especially at the bottom. I have all those dark ink lines down there, but I need dark color values as well. And so I'm sitting here and I'm thinking about it and I'm making a plan. I left this bit in so that you could see that I do pause every once in a while, think about things, and make a plan. It's all right to pause. You don't have to work lickety split fast every single second that you're working. So I'm thinking about what kind of brown I want, and I go in with a very saturated black brown. It's got lots of complementary colors in it to make it as dark as possible. And this one is made from a burnt sienna and a dandelion blue, so I can get this really dark, dark, rich brown. I know it's going to dry a little bit and show some of that ink in the bottom of the beard, but I want it to be as saturated as possible because I want that dark value down there. That beard is curling under his chin and it's very dark, and it's going to give the contrast that I need in my painting. I add the eyebrows. You can see I'm not really worried about getting exactly every single line of ink covered. Uh, I just want a black brown tone in there, neutralized tone. There's no black paint used here. I'm just saying it's that really dark neutralized color that you get mixing these two complements. I really like that purple that I made for the azure on the throat too. I'll have more to say about that maybe later. But here I've decided that I don't like the lightness and the paleness of the background. And even though that means I'm going to lose all the interesting stamped textures that were coming through the light washes, I'm going to go in with very saturated red paint. This is not gouache, it's just very saturated red paint without a lot of water. I'm going to use it to cover the whole background, and that will give me more contrast and a way into the painting because I really feel I need his face to shine. So the lightness of his face needs to shine, but I need to have that dark contrast. Sometimes I do this with marker, but today I'm just doing it with the watercolor, and I'm using a filbert and pushing that paint around, sometimes leaving a little bit of white of the paper showing because I like that cutout look. That's just me. You can take time and go very quickly and, go right up to the paint line. But now, ideally, you'd make a decision about your background before you do anything in the hair. And you already saw me make some yellow strokes in the hair at the top of his head. So I'm either going to lose those, cut around those with the paintbrush, or I'm going to paint over them and have to restate them or leave them because they're lost. So those, again, are your options. Now I've noticed that those colors have all blended together under his nose because they were too wet and wet. So I'm going to have to do something about that. But first I want to do something with the sweatshirt. And that's what I'm doing here again. Very saturated color, watercolor, very thickly applied over that first layer. I'm not really thrilled that at this point everything is showing up very primary colors. There's yellow in the face, there's red in the background, there's blue there, but I'm not worrying about that because I know that this isn't going to be my final decision. I'm going to put other colors on top of this. I always tend to neutralize my colors, if not during the process, but at the very end. So I know that I can always do that. And so the general impression that I'm getting now doesn't bother me. To go back to that neck for a moment, you can see that azure blue that I love so much has granulated in the neck and made a nice modeling, which works with the throat area of his neck because there's also a lot of stubble and stuff from where he shaved. So it gives a nice texture that works there, and I really like that. I've mixed some burnt sienna again with my one of my darker blues. I think it was not the Indanthrum blue this time, but another PB60 that I have. And I'm just putting a little bit of texture here because he's got that fleece thing, and I just want on top of the light texture. And I can do this right now without the other texture being dry because the first paint is not liquid. It was put down very opaquely with not a lot of water. And so while there might be some blurring of the edges, the fuzziness of the texture of the hood, it's not going to totally bloom out because there's not enough water in the original paint, in the paint that I'm applying now, or in my brush. And so that way you can get to apply it still a little bit on the dampness of the other. Now the shirt has been totally dry, and I can go ahead and I can put this color on that and glaze over that, and some of that blue will show through. I'm liking the dark around his neck because it is framing the face more than the paler colors that were there before. It doesn't mean it has to be the last thing that I do in that section, but I'm liking the way that that is going. I've put a little titanium white down on my palette, and I am going to mix that into some of my other colors to get tints. When you add white paint to pigment, you get a tint. And again, this is not dry where I'm applying it. I have very little water on my brush, so that's thick white paint. And now I'm putting it in as the texture, again, building up on that. And there's hardly any water on my brush. There's no water in the white paint, and the paint that was already down there is already very thick and saturated and doesn't have a lot of water. So again, you can only do this if you're maintaining minimum water. If you've got a lot of water in each of those, you have to wait till things dry. But I want to get a little bit of blending, but I want to put some of those highlights, so to speak, on the folds of that fake sheepskin lining of the hood. Now while the hood's drying, I've gone back to the nose where I lifted up some color with a bit of paper towel, but now I'm actually touching the wet, clean brush to the area and mopping some of that color up by putting the paper towel down on top of it. So I want to try and reclaim some of the shape of that nose by picking up some of those loose washes which didn't exactly go where I wanted because they were still too wet when the next one went down and they just sort of ballooned everywhere. So that's what I'm doing, is correcting those here. Now, never do this with your quality brushes. I'm using an old round brush, synthetic fibers, to do this because there's going to be some scrubbing when you put it down clean onto the paper and going back and forth like you just saw me do. I'm scrubbing. That's extremely hard on any brush. So you definitely don't want to do it with your expensive brushes. Now, the other thing that you want to do is that paper towel that I have in my hand. You want to be more careful than I'm being. You want to be careful that when you clean your brush on that, you don't push that dirty part of the paper towel down into your paper. You will transfer color. So always off camera, you don't see me doing this, but I'm changing the position of my paper towel. When I say I'm not very careful about this, what I mean is that I use a paper towel to the bitter end, and I recommend that you start to switch out to cleaner paper towels sooner because it will help you avoid any issues with this. The last thing you want to have happen is to scrub out an area and get it pristine and then plop a paper towel that's dirty there and transfer color from another area. That's just self-defeating. You can go with it and work with it and have fun with it if that happens, but you just want to be aware of that. Just want to draw attention to the way the beard is looking right now. I've got a lot of nice dark volume at the bottom of the beard, which is cool, and you can see through it, but remember how opaque all that was when it went on. There's a lot of color saturation. I'm reworking the eyes here because I want blue, but I want a tint of blue, so I've got a little white in that blue. You don't want to use a lot of water in your brush or in your paint when you're doing this. You want to keep it more or less solid because of the way that this person has those crystal blue eyes. And I want to do them quickly, not build them up with lots and lots of layers. If you do lots and lots of layers approach, which you've seen me do, that's great and has a different look. But for the blue eyes, for this particular thing and working quickly, I just want to use that thicker paint. Here, I'm just using the yellow, but it's been moistened and it's allowed to be thick in the pan. I'm picking it up with very little water on my brush and putting it in where I see a lot of color showing up in the beard. So this is where you're looking at your source, your reference, the model, whatever. You're seeing where the light hits it, and you're putting something of commensurate value onto the piece so that you can capture that likeness of light. We're not worried about the likeness. Oh, there I did add just a little bit of water because I wanted, or white, I wanted to pop even more than just the solid yellow. So I mixed it in with a little bit of white. But sometimes what we're doing is just trying to get some value down. I want to get a little bit of light around the eyes there. Now I can put in some of that hair again with the background there. I can just go right over that. The background will be dry, but if you do it a little bit sooner, you want to make sure that when you're drawing your brush out into the background, you're not picking up the background color and darkening the paint that you have on your brush. So you might have to clean your brush. You'll get a feel for that as you go along. I think a little bit of highlighting, like I'm doing now in the beard, goes a long way. Um, One might even argue I'm being a little fussy here. That's something that you really want to look at your source, see where there's lights coming from something. I've got a little bit of yellow mixed into white, so that's a warm highlight, and it'll sort of dry down and not be as noticeable. But I want to have that around areas like the eyes, so the eyes are alive. I want to have it at the tops of the head and sides so that it looks like there's light hitting those little hairs that are coming off of him. I want little hairs in the beard to come forward. If you don't like and enjoy those things, don't put them in your painting. Focus on other things that are important to you. But these are the types of things that are important to me, and so I want them in there. Now I needed a little bit more light. There was too much contrast there, and so I added in a little bit of light lavender to go in there. But then, it's got to be dark still around there. So I'm playing with this. Again, play with it now, and when you're all done, there's more than ample time after you've got your fresh eye again to look at it and to decide whether or not you like what you've done. And again, stop. And sometimes you have to stop to wait for things to dry. Sometimes you have to stop because you're really looking. And sometimes you have to stop because you're thinking about what you're going to do next. I have to hold it up and look at it because my eyes aren't the best for working under the cameras because of the surgeries. And I need sometimes to just hold it closer to me. And I'm pointing out that I do like the throat area. That's probably one of my favorite bits of the whole painting. And it's all right to have a non-crucial part of the painting be your favorite bit. But I'm still not really happy with the whole contrast situation of this. I'm going to go back and work on the nose. Get that shape in the nose a little more defined. I'm not going to be able to totally come back to a real nose shape unless I decide to paint opaquely over this whole area. But I can still play with it. And that again is something that I'm talking about. If you don't like something, push on it and play with it and see what you can do with it. It's important for me to take the value of the top of the nose bridge away because it does get in the shadow up there. So I'm basically right now trying to reconstruct the nose in some way that I find more pleasing and representative of what I'm seeing. And I've decided I don't like that hood texture, so I'm getting rid of it. So I like the stuff showing through up there, but I'm going to lose all this because I just don't see a way to resolve the jacket. I'm too far in. Get rid of it. I should point out that because it's watercolor, you can just lift things out, but you've got to be careful that the paper will handle that. And I had no way of knowing because this was one of the first times using Blick. So some of this is a risk, but pretty much when you take something out, if you're careful and you don't scrub at it with a paper towel and so on, you can get back to a reasonable texture of paper that is going to allow you to put another color down, as I'm doing here, and you can handle it okay. I don't have a lot of water. This is very opaquely applied, this next layer, because I don't want to worry the paper into being a sodden mess, because that's when your paper starts to pill. Even the best watercolor paper in the world will start to pill under those situations. There I just redrew the shoulder line just a little bit because the collar is gone. I'd like to point out two things. This would be a great time to change your water. Ideally, again, you're going to have 2 buckets of water. I have small space on my table, so I only use one. And then there was some churning around where I've tried to find a thinner brush, smaller, finer brush, to go in and put a second layer of color on top of the now dry eyes. So you want to get a smaller brush for those detail things. Sometimes it's also important to know that you need to get up and dry the painting completely before you continue. So I took 2 minutes here and I got up and I used the hair dryer to dry all the layers so that I didn't go in and mess up the final layers on something that was too wet. I didn't want to work wet and wet. So all of this has been completely dried, and here I am. I'm going to change the background. I've gone in with a bit of a white mixed with watercolor, and the watercolor has been mixed into a purple. This isn't gouache, this is just watercolor. I'm using it opaquely, heavily mixed with the white water, or the white gouache, but this is blue and red watercolor that I've mixed into a lavender, and I want, in a kind of dry brush way, to put it over the top of the red and get an interesting background that I think will work with the other colors that I already have in the painting. For me right now, it's not about a smooth application of this background. It's about getting the color cut in and letting some of the red show through, and some of the purple that was down where his hood used to be, letting some of that show through. And it's okay for me that it's broken. See how dry that brush is? It's leaving splotches. That's because there's very little water. I can't stress this enough. There's very little water in that brush. I took a little bit of the blue and the red that I wanted to mix together, and I put in some white paint, and that's how I got this. Now you'll also see when I go into the water bucket, I'm hardly touching the tip of the brush into the water bucket, because I only want a little dab of water on the brush so that I can push the paint around. This is about paint malleability and nothing more. That's, look at, ding, 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 just a little bit to get a little bit of oomph so that I can push that paint around. Because I'm going over red and I don't have a lot of water on the brush, I'm not worried so much about picking up the original color. If you had more water on your brush, you'd need to check your brush all the time to make sure you're not picking up the color underneath. But that's not really a factor here. And the other thing is, because it's a color that is in the mix that's on the top, if I do get some red coming up, it's not going to be something that I have to worry about. This is one of the most fun things for me, to play with paint this way. And I encourage you to work opaquely. You've seen countless videos of me doing this here on Patreon. It's just fun to push the paint around. And as you do it more and more, you find out what you like. You find out how much water you want to put in. You find out how much of the original color you want to leave. You find out the kind of texture that you want to have over that. Again, I can't stress enough, I picked up barely any water at that point when I just touched in there. And there I'm putting in some more white to get it a little lighter, varying the colors, cutting around, sometimes even, sometimes uneven, because it's fun and it's playing and it seems right when I'm doing, as I play, I'm just having a go, just have a go. And then worry about it when you're all done. But right now, this looks to me like a lot of, I've had a lot of fun, and it looks to me like we're getting close to where I want to be finished. So I just look for any place where there's an odd texture that draws the eye in a place I don't want it to be drawn to. But if I don't see any more of those, then I'll know that I'm done. I've cleaned the water the paint out of my brush. I've mopped most of the water out. I'm going in just to some areas where I want to smooth the color and dragging that moist brush along the top. And that will cause some of the colors to separate and bloom out in interesting ways. And I think that's another fun way to experiment with texture. So use your backgrounds as examples and times to play with things. I don't know why I went into that particular. I had a piece of white gouache out, but here I'm bringing white gouache out of the pan. So I must have used the other up. I don't remember, and I didn't see that happen in the. Well, there we go. More white gouache there. So I do have 2 pans of white on this particular palette, one for zinc and one for titanium white. But sometimes you really want to have that really fresh paint. And here I want to have that highlight over the top of his head. So I've mixed a little bit of titanium white with my coolest yellow. It's essentially like a lemon yellow. And I wanted just the barest hint of titanium, or just the barest hint of yellow in the titanium, because I want it to stay warm, whereas titanium white is a very cool white, and I want it to be warm because I want it to be the brightest highlights. That's where I'm going over with this brush, and you could do it with a small point brush. I'm doing it with my filbert and just the edge of my filbert, and playing with it that way. You can use it with a pointed round, but I'm just going for those areas where I just need a little bit of warm highlight. So some places in the beard, and like you saw around the eyes and at the top of the head. So I'm not being as exact as you could be with this, but you can be exact. And there I'm adding some more yellow into it. So now I want a yellower kind of look to things and not just white looking. So that's what I did there with the nose and under the eye. If you've heard any of my lectures or you've watched my other lessons where I talk about using watercolor opaquely, you'll know that I feel that using transparent and opaque watercolor in the same painting is totally traditional English watercolor as done and employed in the 19th century in British watercolor, which is where I find my roots in watercolor. So I have no contradictory feelings about this. Your eye might find it very jarring to see opaque and transparent passages in the same piece. And you have to work with your eye, either to train your eye by doing more of this and allowing it to see that it works together, or just stick with one or the other. Paint opaquely, paint transparently. But I feel that there's a place to use both within one painting, and that's what I'm doing here. I have taken out some of the white of the paper in his cheek and used that opaque golden color that I have, because I find that that's too much of a highlighted area on that cheek. And again, I'm just going over here and I'm looking for things that I want to knock back a little bit, which means I want to make them less bright. And so I'm putting something that has a little bit more color into it, so it's not just glaringly white. And I've got very dry brush up there to make it look like the light is hitting the individual strands of his eyebrows. And same thing on the hair, very dry brush, very broken application of thicker paint. Here we go, thicker paint over light-colored thicker paint over darker paint to get that broken color. I love that broken color. So that's what you see me doing here. And again, can you overdo this? Yes, most certainly you can overdo it. Many people will think I passed overdoing it 10, 15, 20 minutes ago. But for me, again, this is that aspect of pushing. Let's see what we can get. Let's get down to some finish that we like. Let's check that there's the contrast that we like. And then we'll let it sit. With our fresh eye, we'll come back to it after a couple of days, and we'll decide whether or not we made a botch of it, or whether it was successful. And then if there were only portions of it that were successful, what were those portions? Don't do the post-mortem while you're working. The only thing you're asking yourself while you're working is, what do I want to do next? I want to put this color here. If that changes the value, where do I need to balance that? Do I have the color of the eye that I want? Do I have the shadow in the eye that I want? Do I have the contrast where I want it? Do I have the highlights where I want it? Those are the types of things that you can look at and ask yourself as you're working. Have I fixed the nose sufficiently? Have I made the nose seem rounded? That's what I'm trying to fix right now, is get that nose to round out into a little bit more of a bulbous nature. This guy has like one of the greatest noses on the planet. And we want that to be a highlight and a feature of our painting. So let's work on that. But I'm not thinking about the whole, only the whole in the sense of, is this balanced here? What do I have to do with the rest of it to balance it? But I'm not standing back and saying this isn't working. I'm just pushing the pieces forward because I know that I can change things, and I know that I want to keep going and playing with this. Something that you also have to keep in mind as you're doing this is watching this, is that the lights are going to affect the color in the taping, and the white in the paint is going to make the color look more dull while it's wet and you're looking at it under the camera lights. When we get to the end, you'll see a better approximation of what I was looking at. And this is something that you train yourself to see as you're working. And there's no other way to describe it except that when you're working under the lights that are comfortable for your eyes, then you'll have them set up so that you see color in the way you want to see color, and you'll mix your whites or your other colors in, and you'll see a relative value system across the whole piece. And that's what you're working with. So right now you see a relative value system, and that works, and that's right. And that's how I can work this way. When you get to the end and you see the actual colors, that's more of what I was seeing. But you can still see the values in this. So there's not a big shock or change from that. Here I'm just putting in some more lighter areas, again with some yellow mixed into white, and trying to get things like the mustache to come forward off of his skin. Those are the kinds of things you want to look for so that it becomes dimensional. I also don't worry about whether or not I cover the ink lines. There are some ink lines going on in the nose that I hope I actually do cover, or at least distract the viewer from, because some of those lines were just not correctly placed to get the kind of look and feel that I wanted in the nose. But a lot of people I know paint like this, try to paint like this, and they become obsessed with letting pen show through or not show through. I think you have to try a lot of examples of this. You have to do it multiple times to see what it is that you like to show and what it is that you like to obscure. In some paintings of mine, you'll see that I actually put in the background to obscure lines which go off from the subject in a way that are not helpful. But other times I do transparent backgrounds or transparent interiors, and I let all of those wonky lines show. It's just a matter of what I feel like. For me, there's no right or wrong amount of material that I should leave the pen and ink showing. It's just something that it feels right for me to cover this in this area. It feels wrong for me to cover it in that area. It's a taste thing that I've developed for the way I like to paint over time. And the more that you paint like this, the more you'll develop something that is similar but is set to your tastes. You may always want all the lines to show. And if you do, you might actually find yourself going back in and restating ink lines over the opaque paint which originally hid them. The only thing I would caution you there on is that sometimes if you're not exact, you can end up getting a kind of double vision effect with ink lines that are restated, but not um, restated exactly. And so you see those. Now, it was important in the eyes, just speaking of restating, to restate and get those clear and crisp. But I'm being very careful to be exact on those lines. Or if you've covered something, to draw the new line exactly where you want it. You've seen me do this before in paintings early on in Patreon, where I was doing and working opaquely and getting uh, things that would go over the lines, and then I would need to go restate them, or I would just cover them completely. Now, I had to restate that line on his nose because it wasn't working the way I wanted it. And so I needed to separate it from the cheek space. And ideally, you would do that separation with values of paint. But I tried it for a while and it wasn't working. So I got to pull the plug. I got to do what I know I can get away with, and that's to put a line there. I'm going back and restating some of the other. See, the thing is, once you start restating something, it's kind of a losing proposition in that you have to go back over a lot of things and you have to think about, do you want to restate here? Do you want to restate there? And so really take this with a considered view about how you want the painting to look. And practice many, many hundreds of drawings before you get a clear sense of exactly when and if you want to put the stuff back, because sometimes things will be just very obvious to you that you want to leave the ink out, and other times very obvious that you need to have it in. So what I'm saying is be patient with yourself and go ahead and try things, play with them, and go back and forth. Of course, if you're working on one of those drawing programs on the computer, your iPad, you can have the line work on a separate layer, and you can just plop that back on top, and that will give you all of that, and you can maybe correct that. There's a lot of things you can do on the iPad that you can't do in life with natural materials. But I find it's more satisfying for me at this particular stage in my life to work with the natural materials and go ahead and fix some things, not be able to fix some other things, play with some things. I like the imperfection of it, and I like the joy of using the different materials to get the look I want. Now, this is very important. I'm going around the edge of the beard and I'm roughing it up. I'm drawing out ink lines into other painted areas like the side background, so that you get a sense that that is a fluffy beard, that the background is just not cut and pasted on top of that. And I think it's important that you do that, and you might get some darker areas restated into the beard at the bottom where it is so dark. But it's very important you do that. Another way you can do that kind of effect is you can take a very thin script brush or liner brush, and you can put a mixture of light paint and very little water, and you can get that on the brush, and then you can start in the beard like in a light area on the left side, and you can draw those hairs out into the air behind him, and that's something that you can do there. But I don't do it in this particular one, but that's something that you can do. I find that it isn't important to use the same pen that you use to draw. It can be if the inks are vastly different in color, because some black inks are made with a blue and a yellow. Some are made with, a carbon black, a burnt bone, that kind of thing, charcoal. And so they all have different tinges. And if you use two different inks with different color variations, even though they're both black, that can be a problem. So you want to look at your inks and see which of your inks, from your dip pen inks to your felt tip pens and your brush pen tips, which ones go together, because then you can use the different ones. Here I didn't want to use that original pen that I used because I wanted to have more finesse and easy sloping and curving with the pen, and I don't get that with that new pen that I was trying to begin with. And I know that this ink is very dark black and pigmented, and it will work well with the other ink that's showing through. But keep that in mind. Black inks do vary, and you can get a real incongruous, disjointed look in your painting if you mix two black inks that don't work together. I'm not going to worry about that because if I frame this, it's going to be framed out. And when I scan it, I think in Photoshop, I'll just take color from the side and plop it there. If I try and redo it, it could ruin the nice wash surface that I have. This is last looks for me. I'm taking a moment with a very thin brush to put in some highlights in the eyes and make them pop a little more. But I really, for all intents and purposes, I'm finishing up. I just want to do my last little touch-ups. It's very important that you look at the eyes and you see where the highlights in the eyes are and where the gleam is coming from so that you can interject life into your portrait. And then I'm also looking at, where is the curve in this nose, this oddly shaped nose, so that I can get that going and a little bit more highlight out on the ear. So you go back and forth with those things until you get them the way that you want them. And remember, it's about balance. So sometimes in the process of putting highlights in, you see areas that need to be made darker or need to have contrast increased. And so I've got the lower lip here. I'm restating that bit. And I'm also getting that upper lip, which has got the shadow on it because the upper lip points out at the top and comes in towards the lip crease. So that's in shadow. I've got to darken that up so that it has the contrast that I need to really sell it. And then I want to restate some of the areas and shapes that are around in the nose because that's been giving me the most that I've had to work with, the most struggle to get it the way I wanted it. And each time I have to let the paint dry so that I can then go in. Now you see I can blend it because they're dry enough with a moist brush. I can go in and blend something more like what I see, those blended layers of color going down underneath the bottom of his nose. So that's what I'm able to try and play with now. Those are the types of details that you want to look at and play with and go in and try to get really balanced and have an effect of some realism, even when you're not going after hyperrealism, because this certainly isn't hyperrealism. The clean brush here again, I'm blending some of the eye stuff because it's dry now and I can blend it. You don't try and blend it when it's wet because there's too much water there. And again, all of these things are things that you get a sense for the more you work with the paint. And don't be afraid if you have to go in and fix something with paint and then have to go back in and add more ink if that's the kind of method that you're using. Don't be afraid of that. You can go back and forth. It doesn't matter. What you want to do is get something down on your paper that matches what you envision in your brain using the model that you have in front of you whether it's a reference or it's a live person or it's a still life, whatever it is. You want to notice those things that you notice and you want to get them down. And if your paint is too strident, you want to knock it back. If your ink is too strident, you want to knock it back and forth until you get it the way you want it. This whole last portion of the painting is just me finessing and trying to get balance in different parts of the painting. And this is the fun part. This is where you've got the guts down of the painting, most of it, and now you're just trying to get those last little details, which are going to sell it to your audience and sell it to yourself. Here as I blend this color, I'm looking at very, very small shapes. I know that because of the ink and all the paint that's on here, I'm not going to be able to get them exact, but I want to get them to a closer approximation, and that's why I'm still working on these areas. If you see a detail and you still think that you can perhaps get a little bit better nuance of it, then you work at that. That's what you do in these final moments. And here I've added some blue, so it's a cool blue in there and not just a dark black hole there. And I'm going to restate some of the lip stuff so that same color is there. I want to have the color that I'm using appear in more than one place in the portrait so that there's a unity of color and light source. If there's only one blue light and it's on the nose, that's going to look odd. But if there's some kind of blue light shading on other areas, it seems normal in the reality that I've created within this painting. You'll see me put the eyes in right away. I start with the eyes. I know some people wait until the end to put the eyes in. For me, I'd rather put the eyes in, and if I mess the eyes up, then I can start again if that's if they're so messed up. But what I want to get across to you is that you can change them, you can work on them, even at this late stage. And if that seems problematic to you in any way, do a page of practice eyes. Just practice eyes for a whole page. There isn't on the original reference a dark blue shadow line down there. I need to put that in to create the shapes I want, to give the nose some more volume and 3D-ness, because the original drawing of the nose had errors. And so I'm trying to work myself out of a situation where I created a drawing that was inaccurate, and I want to make something that still reads. And that's what this whole last bit of fussing with this painting is about, is me finding ways to make it read, because I don't want to give up on it, because I see there's something here and I see that I'm bringing it out and I'm liking it more and more as I work with it. If you stop and give up, and if you stop and don't try and do things and push through, you aren't going to get to the finish. And it's really important that we get to the finish as many times as possible so we know what to expect and we know what's possible. And then we take all of those outcomes and we put them into the earlier stages of our drawings. It's how we learn what we're aiming for. So it is absolutely key that you finish as many drawings as possible, but not just in a sloppy, hapdash, slapdash kind of way. It is very thoughtful. You're working with intention, and when you divert from your original intention, you have a new intention that you're working through. And I hope you can see from me talking with you about this as I work what was in my mind when I was working on this. This last portion, because of my eyes here, I've had to tilt it towards me so you're not seeing the little marks I'm making, towards the bottom. The beard has long since dried. I've re-inked some areas to state some darkness to have it come through again. I've adjusted the contrast throughout the image. It's important to take a moment and just rethink the beard and make sure that it goes with the rest of what we have going on. And so I have a dark color here that I'm injecting. I didn't want to go back to ink, but I'm going back with a darker brown and just adding some of that color to knock down and make more volumetric the whole area of color that's down at the bottom of the beard. So again, it's me seeking some balance, me interjecting those little bits of shadow that you see even between the light hairs, like they're right under the lip. I'm putting those little bits of shadow there. It's not just light hair, it's not dark hair. It's light and dark hair mixed together. And you have to find a way to reach in there with your brush and approximate that with your paint color choices so that when the eye looks at it, they say, yeah, that's a beard that I can look into, that I could poke my finger into and it would give, and I would see the darker recesses of it. Here are the light colors that are highlighting, but here are the dark recesses. You'll remember that I started in the eyes with a lot of contrast in that deep maroon red. And now I've covered much of that, and I have that lighter, knocked back blue. It's a grayed out lavender, and it doesn't match the skin on the model's photo. What it matches is my idea of how I need to color and recess those areas so that it reads as recess and it balances with other things that I've since added to the painting, like the background with the lavender color on top. So again, it's about balance, looking for those details and balancing, balancing, balancing. And in the process of balancing, don't forget, you can paint a little here, you can paint a little there, but you're also always judging how wet is the thing I just painted. Can I go in again? Do I have to wait? Okey-doke. All done. Here's the dried piece where you can really see the color, and you can see that those little bits of grayed out blue that I added to the beard in the shadow areas really work nicely. They not only unify the whole, but they make the brown beard seem richer and darker and full of life. So here's my look at it. And this actually is one of my favorite paintings from 2023. It's hanging outside my studio, so every time I walk out of the door, this is greeting me. And it just fills my heart with joy because I love the interplay of color and I love the memory of working and trying to make that nose come forward. And I love that lavender on the neck. Have some fun with your paint today. Really push it. Go as far as you can. Take a break if you need to. Come back. Always look for the balance across the whole piece. Dry something completely if it's not a good time to put new paint on. That's what your hair dryer is for. Go ahead and use it. Or walk away and let it dry naturally, but I think it's nice to keep the momentum and keep working. Whatever it is, push through, get something done, and we'll catch up with you later.